So this is the second session in the ETF Elevate sessions we're running with Microsoft. The ETF stands for Educational Transformation Framework, and we're going to look at the Educational Transformation Framework from Microsoft to bring about digital transformation in your schools. And this session focuses primarily on classroom learning impact. Each of the sessions are linked, so the previous session, session 1, is quite important to go back and watch if you're watching this retrospectively. Or if you were in that session previously, make sure that you bring everything we discussed in that session into this session. Each of the times that we meet, we will be looking a little bit at the Educational Transformation Framework from Microsoft. The next session, session 3, will be particularly heavily focused on the Educational Transformation Framework, but we're also investigating apps from Microsoft and how they could impact on classroom practice or vision for the school or whole school improvement. And today we're going to be having a look at OneNote and how that can be used in the classroom to have impact in teaching and learning, both face-to-face or through blended learning or distance learning. And some people I know that are joining us this afternoon have been with me on previous sessions and are already using OneNote, so I'd be really inspired to hear from you and understand what you've been doing with that. And for those of you that are just discovering OneNote or maybe seeing it for the first time this afternoon, don't worry. It looks at first like it's got a lot of options available to you, but it's a really powerful tool, and the first thing to do is just to get to grips with it and understand how it could work in your school. So this is session 2. There will be some further sessions coming up on the dates that you can see through November and into December. As said, the next session will be almost exclusively on the Educational Transformation Framework and links back to the areas we've covered in sessions 1 and sessions 2 today. So we're going to look at digital transformation first of all, and why we should be engaging with digital transformation absolutely now. There's so much going on in the world, but it's been a massive driver to bringing about an openness in education about, well, is now the time to change further still? And some of the things that we've been forced to do, we wouldn't have necessarily adopted if coronavirus hadn't arrived. But as it hasn't always been as painful as some people would imagine, and actually opened up an awful lot of doors and new possibilities. And we want to discuss that today. So we are in a changing world. It's something we have to accept, and technology is causing that change to accelerate at even faster pace, but also global events. We only have to look at what's going on in the news today. We want everybody to really move forward together with change. So part of our discussion around using the Educational Transformation Framework is that we get everybody involved. We hear what is important to them, we consider how any changes are going to impact upon them, and we make sure that we bring them with us on this transformation journey. The future for our pupils or our students, if you're in secondary school, will look really different. We've got things like artificial intelligence, which are starting to take on some of the tasks which required people to sit there and input data or analyze data. That just happens. And there are algorithms that run, which takes in huge amounts of information from all different sources and processes that and comes up with answers. And that means that some occupation groups or jobs won't exist in the future or will look really different. And that doesn't necessarily have to be something that people feel threatened about. It means that we just need to think slightly differently about how we're going to prepare those pupils and students for their life in the world that they're going to enter into, and maybe focus less on preparing them for certain jobs and give them, actually I know we've been working out in education, is that transferable skill set, but bringing in that transferable skill set to technology skills. The fact that you've got 47% of jobs are going to possibly be taken up by machines or artificial intelligence. Okay, those will be lost, but plenty of other avenues are going to open up. And those exciting opportunities that may lay there for them could only students have been prepared for them and they've got the skills to engage with it. And you think, well, with all of that there, we need to take a step back and consider today, for the now, just what we're going to do in our schools currently to prepare and adapt for the future and make sure that we give people the best possible opportunities to go out into the world, or as they progress through education, and make the most of what they're experiencing and then use that to build upon it further. And that starts with the leaders in our schools. And that's one of the reasons why we want to work with you. And it's one of the reasons why Microsoft have asked us to speak with you today and make sure that you're considering all of the opportunities and options open to you to shape a different future for your school. The challenges listed on this slide are quite frequently thought about, I know, in leadership teams across the country and also by teachers working in grassroots classrooms and the wider staff in schools. That thinking big has to start with the small steps. It's great to have ambitious vision and want to drive the school or the academy or the trust towards an end goal, but you really need to think about, well, what are the small steps that we need to undertake to get there, and how easy are some of those going to be? It isn't always a case that that some of those small steps can be overcome very, very quickly. Some of them may take a longer period of time. They may require investment. They may require staff retraining. They may require you to bring in new technology, all of which is possible, but it's important to understand that those steps all run at different paces, but that you are then allowing the leaders to bring about that transformation, and then you slowly empower the teachers to make the most of those changes in their roles, and also that the students or the pupils benefit massively from it, and that you have a chance to be innovative, and that it gets away from automation and students doing the same old things, or teachers having to deliver very similar scenarios, that you've got new opportunities to you. You've got new technology, whether it's software or hardware, and that may well bring about a different way of delivering something in the classroom that hasn't been possible previously, but now you're able to leverage that and you're able to use it in different ways, and that you will end up having some feedback, because very often with the systems that we're bringing in, there's quite a bit of data. I know, for instance, if we talked about Microsoft Teams, if I look at the dashboard for my school, I can quite quickly see how many pupils have been engaging with the resources that I've given to them, how much time they're spending on different activities, whether they're not able to get in or not. And as a classroom teacher, that gives me a great insight into, is this having the sort of levels of engagement that I want? If it isn't, then I can reevaluate and think why it isn't. But if I'm getting particular success in one class, I can really drill down and understand, well, why is it so good here, and why am I struggling there? And can I bring some of what's amazing and excellent from here and transfer it over to there? So the transformation really does matter, in the fact that we need to think about how we're going to tailor the processes we've had in education for a long time. And do they need to change? Are they absolutely fine the way they are, because we don't want to tinker with it if it's not broken? Or are there new technologies that could enhance it further still? But how are we going to bring them in? And it's about thinking about how we deliver that equality across the school, so that the innovations that we introduce help to level the playing fields and make sure that there is an access to education, or high quality education being delivered, that it meets the learning outcomes that we're after, and that it doesn't detract from what we're trying to do as a school. The last thing that I want to advocate in any of these sessions is introducing technology for the sake of it. And to be very clear, I'm not suggesting that technology is going to replace traditional methods of pencil and paper and classroom teaching. What we're saying is that there's opportunities here where we could enhance what you've got, or find a different way of doing it. And it might use that for some of the time, but you certainly wouldn't use that for all of the time. So we want to empower those students. We want to think of ways that we could personalize learning, with something we've been trying to strive towards, but in a manageable way. We don't want to drive teachers crazy by trying to personalize learning. So are there ways that technology can make that easier, so we don't have to work quite so hard, but we could work quite smartly in the way that we approach getting learning opportunities to pupils? And also, what skills do we need to give pupils in order to successfully access a new piece of software or a new piece of technology? But on the flip side of that, what do we need to do for our staff so they feel confident in delivering these changes and actually realizing that in the classroom or within their roles in the school? It doesn't have to be all classroom focused. So the possibilities for transformation is rethinking the spaces that we have for learning. Do we need to have spaces that are more flexible, where we can not be worried, COVID permitting in the future, to push the desks back and have an open space or reconfigure that classroom. And I know I've worked with colleagues that do that brilliantly, and some other colleagues feel a bit worried about losing that formality of the classroom structure you've got, and maybe, but you will be amazed that sometimes the pupils will respond so positively by having that change to the classroom environment and having that new opportunity to engage in their learning in a different way. The taking the education, and again, COVID-19 permitting, using some of the outside spaces. A lot of the time in schools, we have fairly good wireless coverage these days. And I know that I could probably go outside of the classrooms that I teach in, and I could get a reasonable distance from the school. And I'm getting devices that are smaller, lighter, have more features such as cameras to capture information, that maybe have flip screens as I reinvest in school from traditional laptops to newer devices. And could I take those out for learning opportunities, or could I just take them out on field trips, visits, once we get back to normal education? And then how that personalized learning makes things enjoyable and engages those pupils, and we get into that deeper learning rather than that shallower learning that we might be. They get immersed in the world, so they might use Minecraft, and instead of thinking about the structure of a building or how to make a bridge, all of a sudden, because they're in that world in Minecraft, they could be building a bridge or rebuilding a suspension bridge. And it's not just the shallow learning of how to build it, they're thinking about the shapes, the mathematics involved. At first they'll try something and they won't succeed, so they build that resilience in learning. And in that depth of learning really does come about by bringing the technology into the classroom. So thinking now about what that digital transformation might look like is going to be really important. And this feeds into session 3. And really today I'm starting you thinking about, well, how does it look? So we might be at the moment delivering some remote learning, and in the future that might then transform into hybrid learning, where we've got traditional methods and we've got technology in the classroom. At the moment, we might be having to rely more upon technology to reach students that are at home that are self-isolating. Maybe we've got a year group as a bubble, but technology can offer ways of getting to them. And last session, we looked at how Teams could do that. Today, we're going to have a look at how OneNote did that. So phase 1, we've got a disruption of some sort. Phase 2, there's going to be a transition period where we readjust. We've been doing that massively during the spring and the summer terms with everything that was thrown us. And that transition, the rate of transition and change was very fast. But we had to re-image what we were doing. And a lot of the schools that I'm working with have had to bring in these distance learning platforms so that you can get to pupils and you can still deliver hopefully the same quality of learning. Of course, that brings about further disruption, because you're going to suddenly have parents contacting us saying, well, don't expect us to have a device at home that's capable of accessing it. And it's thinking about, well, how can we get access to the learning resources, but on a range of devices and so forth. And all of those challenges will keep coming in waves, but they will gradually dissipate as time goes on and people become more comfortable with learning the technology, using the technology and learning how it fits with their role. And also students become more comfortable with how it fits into their learning, and they just use it as another tool in their arsenal to be successful in achieving what they're trying to approach that day or that lesson or to that project. And it's really important as educational leaders, we reflect upon the lessons that have learned. We've learned an awful lot so far about bringing technology into the classroom and then how it's going to change the way the school works. That's thrown up questions around things like safeguarding, operational procedures. We've had to reevaluate, well, if we've got teachers online and they're delivering lessons and it's live video lessons, what do we need to consider around that? Should we have live lessons? Should we use pre-recorded lessons? What are the operational procedures for a member of staff engaging and using the technology in that way? And now I'm starting to see really clearly that there's a learning agenda, and it's being driven more and more by adoption of technology or technology supporting traditional teaching methods. So thinking about, well, what skills do we need to give students and how are they going to thrive in that complex world? It's a bigger challenge, and I perfectly accept that when you go down the year group. So I've worked quite extensively with reception and some early years practitioners, also with Key Stage 1, where people have said, well, it's impossible. How can you start to use the same technology? And it's about paring it back and picking the pieces that work for you. So in the last session, we spoke about in Teams, just using posts. And if it was early years, I might, just as an early years practitioner working reception, I might record a video where I read a chapter of the book, and all the pupil does is they log in with the support of the parent and they listen to their teacher reading a chapter of the book. And that's the most that we do with them in that scenario. Or we could have approaching a activity that's capable of being delivered in the classroom, but also we have it so it could be delivered at home. So we may be looking at an activity in reception about volumes of water in different shaped containers, and that's the learning goal that we're assessing on that day. And we record a short video of that as a teacher. We could use jugs or different vessels at home, but also you could have them set out in tables in the classroom, and the pupils at home that are accessing that learning in a distance way could be as successful as achieving the outcomes as the pupils you've got in class with you. And then depending on the technology available and the time from the parents, you may be lucky enough to get some comments back as replies. You may even get the odd video if you're really fortunate. But it's about how we ensure that equality and that access to learning, and also how do we make sure that the remote learning is something that we learn from. If we did something on one day and we've had a really bad reception from parents or pupils, then we clearly aren't going to do it again. Could we tweak what we've done, or do we just put it to one side and we try something else? And part of coming along to sessions like this from Microsoft and Turn It On is to stimulate that thought process, but also because we've got you together as a group and a community that are going to work through these 7 sessions. As I said during session 1, we want you to start sharing the success you had in your schools and thinking about, well, if there's something that's worked for them, could it work for us, and how could we take that back or tweak it in our situation, and how could we make it work in our school? So it's thinking about those flexible spaces. Could we reconfigure in some way? Could it work? The flexible space might be using the technology at home, not just in the classroom. We've also got the consideration of we'd love to have one-to-one devices, but for budgetary reasons, very often that doesn't allow. But what we may have is a set of devices that we could book for a period of time, or we can pre-book and they can come into our classroom. So we deliver a section of the curriculum on those one-to-one devices, because they are one-to-one during that lesson, and the pupils have an opportunity to engage with the technology singly instead of as groups. But it won't always be possible, and I know that Nirvana is just completely impossible in a lot of situations because of budgetary reasons. So it's thinking about how we can make more of what we've got and how we can tweak the deployment of that in school, instead of just trying to think, well, it's not going to be possible in the first place. Part of what we're also looking at is how we can use different teaching approaches like flipped learning for getting pupils engaged with teaching in different ways, revisiting it in different ways, and starting to think for teaching, well, how can we get access for pupils to resources from anytime, anywhere? If they're in platforms like Teams or also in OneNote, which is what we're going to look at later on in the session today, it doesn't have to be that the one-to-one device is the barrier to learning, because you may be able to access that platform from a web browser, and it could be accessed from most things. So if they're at home and the parents only got a mobile phone, very often a lot of these things could be accessed on that screen. I fully appreciate the size of the screen could be a limitation, but it's quite capable of delivering some of the opportunities that you might want to achieve. And then it's thinking about, well, how do I bring this into context, and how do we use it to investigate those more complex, deeper learning questions? How can we set problems to solve, learning challenges? We know that time is tight, and the fact that we've got a lot to deliver in the curriculum, and it can be dominated by some subjects, but it could be that the technology kills 2 birds in 1 stone. So you can deliver some computing along with maths. I've used some really great lessons again in Minecraft Education Edition, where we've looked at areas of maths such as, let's say, area or perimeter, and there's pre-written lessons where you can get pupils to go in and they will use blocks that are in Minecraft to work out the perimeter of a rectangle and then maybe the area of it, and then they can remix that. They can start to build their own shapes. And you could move from 2D to 3D depending on which educational phase you're teaching in, but then you can use that for the pupils to harness and take control of the learning, and they can then get other pupils to join them in that Minecraft world and get them to start to work out, well, what is the perimeter of this shape, what's the area of this shape, and then see if they can get to the end of that problem. And it's not about necessarily finding the answer. It's about them working together on the journey and then raising standards wholly in the class, or in a distance learning scenario, by them thinking about how to get to the answer, how to be successful in their learning, rather than is what was the answer as the outcome. And it's also then about personalizing and enjoying that learning. And that example I just gave you there is a great way. We've been doing perimeter and area in many different ways in maths for years and years and years, but all of a sudden there's another opportunity for them to really personalize that learning, and they make it really enjoyable, because it's the same thing that they're learning, but it's in a different world. And it can be a bit threatening to teachers, which is why Turn It On runs courses for things like the Minecraft Education Edition, but also the level of engagement that some of those really difficult to reach pupils, which would have been completely disengaged by drawing it on squared paper in their book, all of a sudden become really animated, and they fully understand the learning that you're trying to get them to undertake, purely because you're delivering it to them in a different context, using that vehicle of Minecraft Education Edition in this example. So that for you as a teacher, whether you're assessing formatively or summatively, you start to get a really good opportunity to circulate around that classroom, because all of a sudden they're that engaged and they're that liking what they're doing, involved with the technology, that they're on task and they're doing what you ask. So it gives you more time to go around and have maybe small group interventions if it's required, but also to go around and have those learning discussions in your classroom and check the depth of understanding, check what's going on. Is that learning secure? Do I need to revisit it another way? So there's lots of different ways that the technology can open up new doors to you. In that also can be harnessed in the way of the data that you get back. I said earlier that you can get an insight and a window into, for instance, how pupils are using Teams. And if you've got a bubble out and you've got a group of pupils that are out for a number of weeks, that you can still get an understanding of how much they're engaging, how much time they're spending on their learning, through the data that's available to you as leadership teams or subject coordinators or phase leaders, because you can dip back into Teams and you can see, either on an individual basis or a whole class basis or across your class teams, just how much success you're having. And do you need to find some way? Is it that you haven't reached the parents yet, so the parents haven't understood the importance of getting pupils to sit down quietly and get some time with that shared device in their house that maybe they are sharing with other siblings, but they do need it for that 1 hour when you've gone to the trouble of making sure that there's a really high quality lesson. There's a member of staff there to work with them in a digital virtual way, but they've still got access to that member of staff even though they're not in school. So considerations that school leaders are mulling over, and some of these will have been around for many years, but others will have been more important now because we are grappling with the change and the rate of change. But you can find some very interesting offsets by bringing in the technology and the educational transformation framework. I often see some of the pupils that would present some significant behaviour issues, or really presented me with classroom management challenges, where I knew I had to work very hard with that group of pupils. Sometimes by bringing in the technology, some of those behaviour issues have just melted away because of the way that they're starting to engage with the learning and they're changing. It sometimes can be that initially parents resented the technology and maybe saw it as a threat, or their child was going to be compromised in some way by logging into this digital world and not having that face-to-face teaching. But over time, they've understood the value that it can add, and also that for them as a parent, they may be able to see more readily the work that's been set for their child and help them and support them. So in turn, they're supporting the school more effectively. It is just that bigger picture and thinking, well, what are the bits that are important considerations for you? What bits go to one side because you've already addressed those and it's not part of the change, or it's not part of your vision for the school? And then thinking, well, in the longer term, what's going to be those challenges? What's going to be the things that we really need to invest some time in and some thought, and engage the wider staff and get them thinking about how it's going to look in their classroom, how it's going to look in their role in the school, and also how it's going to affect the pupils in a positive way. So I'm going to throw a couple of questions over to you now. What challenges resonate with you and your school? And can you think of anything specifically in your school that you do want to address in the transformation and we will really pick up and capitalize on in session 3 and in what's remaining of session 2? So I'm just going to give you a minute to think about that, and then I'll ask people to feedback. Okay, anybody wish to share the changes they want to bring in their school, any challenges they think they're facing, or anything they think would be difficult to bring about an educational transformation? Feel free to unmute if it's easier, or you can type into the chat if you wish. Silence. Don't be shy. Feel free to share. No, okay, all right. I will move on, but don't feel like you can't contribute in these sessions, and we will be asking for more and more insight into the challenges you are facing as we go through these sessions. So the question is, where are you? The educational transformation framework from Microsoft looks at 4 key pillars. It looks at leadership and policy, teaching and learning, how to foster intelligent environments, and then also pupil school success. And around that, circling on the other side, will be your visions and objectives as trust or a school or an academy. It will also be your priorities as a school. It will also be your current versus your desired place that you want to get to, and then that roadmap of your journey that you're going to take to reach it. But also that evaluation of how you're going to deploy technology to bring about those changes, and how that plan's going to be implemented, and how that plan is also reshaped ongoing, because whatever plan you start with, I guarantee it will look very different from the first one that you produced, and it will just continue to be reshaped by either external factors such as COVID-19 or internal factors, staff changes, budgetary constraints, or even new technologies that come along. So the reason that we are going to use the educational transformation framework in the 4 pillars is to bring about those deeper discussions, and it's something that I want to make sure that you are undertaking, that we're going to use in session 3, and I'll come on to that in just a tick. But in session 3, we're going to unpick these 4 pillars. But what I want to do today is just to talk about them in a little bit more detail, almost just to preview where we're going to go with session 3, and then in session 3 to get your feedback about your plans and how they might feed into these 4 pillars, and whether one of these 4 pillars is actually more relevant and important to you than another, or whether you're going to focus on a single pillar exclusively for the first year and you're going to move on to another pillar in the second year. So the leadership and policy is about bringing about that culture of flexibility and thinking about what are the policies and processes that we got in place, and are they still fit for what we want to achieve, or could we bring about some evaluation of where we are now and think about, for the leadership of the organization we're working, whether it's trust-based, whether it's school or you're an academy and a trust, what are going to be the factors that are going to affect staff, pupils, what are going to affect our parents, and how could we bring about that policy change, that procedural change that's going to influence the leadership of the school and the direction of the school, but do it in a manageable way that means that everybody stays with you. With that, you've got to consider what sort of results you want. So I've put this table together really is the most common scenarios where we're thinking about the approach and impact, the longevity of that and how it's going to affect the school, but also the depth of the change. Is it going to be pretty cosmetic and surface based, or is it going to be really deep and fundamental? And also the scale across the organization. And looking down the list, the one that has the greatest impact, which is underpins the educational transformation framework, is that collaborative vision and making sure you have consulted and spoken with everyone, making sure you've thought about the feedback that you've received from them, and also about how it's going to affect them. And that collaborative vision is the way that really you are going to secure that long-term change with that really deep fundamental change, but also having a widespread impact. You can have a compliance-driven approach, and yes, that does have long-term change, but it can be cosmetic in some instances, and that you find people almost pedaling against it, and under the surface people might nod and agree, but they aren't necessarily coming on the same bus with you and moving in the same direction. And then you might step back and question, well, why has that change not been as effective? And when you scratch the surface, you find you've got a core group of people that are just not engaged with it and just not adopting it on a daily basis. And it might be widespread, or it may not be. So it's thinking of the collaborative vision and how that collaborative approach of getting everybody involved can be achieved. And it does take time to do that, but it's worth the investment in order to get that depth of change, to get that long-term approach, but also for it to be widespread either across a school or a group of schools or academies or across a whole trust. The leadership discussions that I'd be encouraging you to have, and again, we'll pick more of these up in session 3, is about, well, what's your current approach? Does that work? Is it really effective, or can we bring in some other areas? Also, do you think this is going to work moving forwards, or do we need to adapt? And is there a vision document? Is there somewhere we've captured all this? Have we brought it together? Yes, it might be in lots of people's brains, and yes, we might talk about it frequently, but has it been recorded somewhere? And is it generally open for other people to see what the vision is, the direction of travel, how long it's going to take to get there? And does it need to be developed further still? And what out of that vision is going to be our absolute key priorities, year 1, year 2, year 3? And we do that with vision planning in school, but we don't always give it the same level of thought with technology transformation. And sometimes we get frustrated because we feel that technology isn't working with us or isn't delivering what's promised. And sometimes that because we are expecting it to work miracles in a too short space of time, and sometimes something better's come along. So there's that constant reevaluation, which is really important. Alongside the first pillar we looked at with leadership, we've got intelligent environments, thinking about what we have currently in school. If we've still got an ICT suite, and maybe we haven't got devices that can go into classrooms that are mobile based, is that going to give us the degree of flexibility that we're looking for? Is it going to be that we need to invest changes? We need to investigate what's the best device to invest in, what's going to work best across all of the pupils we've got for the educational phase we're working in, and what's going to keep those pupils secure and safe, but allow them the openness to take technology and bend it and flex it to suit the learning that they're undertaking. We're thinking about the student success, which links into the pillar we were just in previously, to make sure that we're quite inclusive in the technology that we have. One of the reasons that we say Teams is quite flexible, because you could have absolutely any device. You could have an Android tablet, you could have a mobile phone, you might be lucky enough to have a laptop or a desktop computer at home that you could access as a pupil, but there's lots of different ways to get to that technology of Teams or what's going on within Teams that we'll look at. OneNote is an element of that in a little bit. So the access is fair and it doesn't have to be prohibitive. Some schools have been fortunate enough to get devices from the government already, but very often those devices aren't necessarily a device that's going to cover every single pupil that we need to hit in a school. So is there any way we could repurpose and rebuild some of those old devices? So maybe they just have Windows on there as an operating system, but a lot of what they're going to use is primarily browser based, which then increases the chance to get some of those old devices back out if it's a distance learning scenario, and they've got a device at home where they normally wouldn't have had a device to successfully access the learning you've got in school. And also thinking about when they're in there and they're using the platform we're providing, how is it going to develop their skills and make them a better prepared person for the future, and the curveballs that it may present in the way that some of the cultures they're going to go into, some of the jobs they're going to go into, which just don't currently exist in the way that they are now. And then for us internally, how is that going to inform the quality of teaching and learning? How do we need to support our staff in developing their skill sets? How do we need to make sure as a school that we provided equipment or platforms for them to get into that are fit for purpose to support them in being successful in the classroom? And also, if we're asking them to provide personalized learning, how can we do that with the least demand on the staff, thinking about work-life balance? If we can get more time freed up for them to work with pupils and students in the classroom, and it's less about having to administrate a system, then it's got to be a win-win for everyone. And if that experience is that the technology is an easy tool to access and it actually isn't something that takes a lot of time to learn and grapple with, it's what would help to impact positively upon the teaching and learning. So the needs of the modern learner are many, and some of them are listed there. But a lot. And part of looking at the educational transformation framework is going through these 4 pillars and understanding, well, what do they look like in my school? And in that vision planning, in that longer term planning, what do we need to do to be successful in order to hit as many of these different areas as possible? And there's going to be lots of different pedagogical practices we can bring in. The flipped learning we've already mentioned, but the seamless learning is one thing that technology brings together quite nicely, that there doesn't have to be an edge to the learning. And if they've been doing something in classroom, platforms like Teams mean that they could pick up what they've been doing in class with the teacher at home, providing them access to a device as easily as they're in school. So it doesn't have to be that the learning is compartmentalized in school and there's a fence around it and they haven't got their book with them, so therefore they can't show their parents what they were doing, or they can't refer to what they were doing during the lesson, and that's a barrier to them being as successful with doing their homework, for instance. But it's also about, if you're going to give them a platform such as Office 365, there's lots of other apps in there they can go and experiment with. And I've often said, could you go away and present something back to me? And all of a sudden, I've got pupils coming back to me and someone's decided to present it in Minecraft because they've used Minecraft for gaming, but actually the education edition lends itself quite well. Some other pupils have gone and done the traditional PowerPoint, but other pupils have gone and made a sway. So that you'd be amazed if you give them the tools, the way that they decide to use them and bend them and then use that to present the work back or and weave it into their own learning. And then that just helps the whole class because it opens the eyes of the other people that didn't even realize that tool was there, or it could be used in that particular way. And in that change process, it's thinking about, well, how do we make sure that we don't fall into that chasm in the middle? So we've got the enthusiasts, but they won't usually make up a small percentage of your school or your trust. But it's really important to capitalize upon their enthusiasm and make sure that that feeds out across the school as much as possible, and maybe give them some responsibility for developing that in school, because if they're that passionate about it, they're going to be one of the great advocates for driving this forward. But you may have those visionaries as well, those ones that are already dabbling in it and they're ahead of the other people in the school or the organization that could really bring about quite a bit of change. There's often more of those than those people that are those diehard enthusiasts. And in there, you've got those pragmatists. They stick with the herd. So if they've heard that someone's doing it and it's worked, they might come along, but they also are your biggest chasm to move about and create that change with. And then at the other end, you've got those more conservative members of staff, or even those skeptics that go, just, do you know what, I'm not changing for anything. Or those that think, well, I'll let those early adopters that go ahead and they bring it in, or those visionaries do it, let them find out the pitfalls and I'll bring it into my practice later. But you need to bring more of those towards the center of that standard deviation curve and get them falling in towards the early majority rather than the late majority, and giving people technology tools that work, that do what we promise they will deliver, and that are not too baffling to access, but also giving them the training and support. Through that educational transformation framework can really drive you towards the left-hand side of that graph rather than the right-hand side of that graph. One of the things that I've been asking people to do since the very first session and in through session 1 is to go to the Educational Transformation Framework Assessment Tool. And that Educational Transformation Assessment Framework tool is something I want you to feed back to us as a wider community in session 3. It doesn't take long. It asks you to go through and self-assess based on the 4 pillars that we've just looked at, where your school is now, or where your trust is now, and where you would like it to be in the future. And what you will get is a really condensed, concise report that assesses how you might achieve that. And I want us to share that in session 3. And session 3 is going to be even more heavily embedded into the Educational Transformation Framework. But it's only going to work really well if we get you feeding back your assessment reports. So the aim is for the 10th of November, which is our next session, for you to tell us what your tailored recommendations were and any perceived challenges around those. Because let's be open and honest, there may be places that it recommends you get to, but there may be some very, very tricky things to overcome. And part of what we want to do as a community is share that good practice, share those ideas and help you overcome it together. What we're going to focus on in the second half of the sessions is one of the tools that we can use in order to help teachers be successful. And we've got many of the schools that we work with that have got Office 365 starting to look at how OneNote could transform teaching either on a day-to-day basis or in a blended learning or a distance learning scenario. And OneNote often get asked, well, what is it? How is it going to work? And is it going to be of any benefit to me? So think of it like a lever arch folder or a digital ring binder, and OneNote would be the place where you keep all your planning. But instead of your planning being necessarily teacher focused, you're more open with it, and it's something that you're going to share your planning openly with the pupils. But you divide it up into sections, and then inside you've got pages. So the sections would be like the cardboard dividers in your ring binder, and then you put different pages, you hole punch them, and you put them into the different sections. So some of that paper might be plain paper where you've doodled and you've just mind mapped something. Other pieces of paper may be more formal, you've got lines and you've written something down. Other pieces of paper may be more mathematical because it's graph based, or it's squared paper and you've been planning something over. But all those pages get organized into the sections. And what it gives you is an organized structure. And for pupils, it can be really helpful, whether they're working on a one-to-one device or whether they've only got access to a shared device for a little bit of time. But they can get access to the learning that's been captured in the OneNote, and it might have gone on during a lesson, or it might be they weren't able to join that lesson and they want to go back to see the learning that they weren't able to access at that point of time. But the OneNote as a platform gives you a blank canvas to keep everything together and put it into one place. So rather than me talk about it, I want to spend the last half of this session showing you what that looks like and how it would work for you. So I'm just going to stop sharing that screen. I'm going to nip over and share one of the other screens for you. And I'll just do that now. So you should all see a set of teams that I've used for training. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus here as a demo primary classroom, but OneNote will work equally as well in a secondary scenario. So what I'm about to show you will work whichever educational phase you are in. So I'm going to go into my primary team. And this isn't about teams today. In OneNote, Class Notebook is available as an individual app, and you can access that individual app by going to the app launcher here. OneNote Class Notebook is there, so you can access it as a standalone app, but it's also embedded inside of Teams as well. And if you think you don't want to use it in Teams, you just want to use it in its own right, so you click on OneNote there and it will load up and you will get it as an app. That app could be used in a web browser, but it also could be used as a dedicated app installed on your computer. Rather confusingly, there are 3 versions of OneNote and OneNote Class Notebook. There's a version that comes included in Windows 10. There's a version that can come in your Office, so whether you download 365, the desktop version that installs on your computer, or you're using Office 2019 or Office 2016. And there's another version, which is the online version that we're using here. At the moment, there is no current roadmap to amalgamate them into a single product. and they will have a slightly different layout, and some of them will have the odd feature which isn't available in the other. But the best version to use is the online version in the web browser as a tab. So either there is a single individual entity, or within Teams, which is what I'm going to focus on during this session this afternoon, you click on Class Notebook, and Class Notebook is really designed for that day-to-day teaching and to make your resources that you use for delivering high quality learning in the classroom accessible from anywhere to anyone that's a member of the class team. So the only people that are going to be able to get to what's recorded in your OneNote that are in this class team, or students in a secondary scenario, and the staff that are assigned, be it the class teacher, the support staff. It's ring-fenced, so it's a safe environment, but it also means that pupils can get to the learning content wherever they are. So I described it as a ring binder or a lever arch file, and things are organized in sections. You've got your sections down the side, so every single pupil, and I'm in a teacher view at the moment, but every single pupil in your class would have their own section. So for you, even if you haven't got pupils with you in class all the time, maybe you're working on a rotation, or as I said, you've got a bubble out for a period of time, you can get to their work. So if I uncollapse Henry's folder there, I've set out my section of subjects: maths, English, science, and homework. You can have those sections as anything you like, and you could rename them at any point in time. So some schools I work with in the primary sector will have these as weeks, and you'll put the Monday of the date of the week, and then all the subjects go in the week section. Other schools say, well, for the whole term we're going to, or the whole academic year, depending on how you want to organize it, we're going to have all our maths work in those sections, and the pages will be the different areas we look at in maths or English. And in secondary, it tends to be organized a slightly different way. So you would have normally a team for each subject, and then down the side here, instead of having a single channel, you would have different sets within that subject. So if you've got year 7, and let's say in secondary you've got 4 sets for science or maths, you might have year 7 set 1, year 7 set 2, year 7 set 3, and they all sit within maths, and then the teachers only see the sets they are teaching, but the subject coordinator might be able to dip in and out of all the channels to see all the sets. The idea in primary of keeping it with a single channel is it's less confusing for younger children, and they know just to go to general in Class Notebook, and they'll find their folder in here. And if I was in as a pupil, I would only see my folder. So if I was Henry, I would just see Henry. I wouldn't see any of the other pupils. But because I'm in here as a teacher view, I can dip in and out of those pupils. So it's really easy for me to go and check the work they've been doing. If I wanted to see what Henry's been doing in maths and on subtraction, I can go into here. I set him something on 2 minus 4 as a really simplistic example. And when he's written on there in his work, a bit like opening up his physical book in the classroom, it gives me ease of access, but it's also really easy for Henry to go into his individualized folder. What he does is private to him. It's not open and visible to every other member of the class. But if you want to share something, OneNote has other areas for doing that. So as well as the individual areas you've got here, what you've got are collaboration spaces, a content library, and teachers only, and I'll explain those to you. So the collaboration space would be, if you've prepared a resource as a teacher, it does what it says on the tin. It is collaborative. So if you've got, let's say you're developing a class charter, and you've moved into the world of online, and here you developed a class charter with some tick boxes, and you want students or pupils to tick when they understood that that's something they need to adhere to as a class charter, you could make it. You could also put other resources onto the page. So the page doesn't have to be limited to typed text. You can write onto it, because I could use this on an interactive whiteboard, whether you've got smart boards, Prometheans, BenQ, whatever it is in your board. You could have this up in the classroom, and I can make a bigger area to work on by expanding it there. So I've got plenty of space. So if I write on it with a stylus, I've got drawing tools here. I haven't got a touch-enabled device at the moment, but if I wanted to say hello, I can type on it in here, and that gets recorded as easily as me typing into it. It can do pictures, you could have animations on the page, you can drop in videos, you can drop files onto the surface of the page that you want students to pick up. So there's lots of different ways to do that. And what they can then do is they can add on to it if it's in the collaborative area. So you need to teach pupils to be respectful of each other's work if you put a document in there, because anyone can edit, anyone can delete and modify. But if you're trying to build a collaborative document and you want them to do something together, so it might be that I've got topic work and I'm going to set each small group of pupils in my class to go and investigate a different aspect of Egypt. So I want to look about what does housing look like for Egyptians, what sort of food do they eat, what sort of cultures have they got, what are their religious beliefs. I could have all those different groups either virtually through distance learning, or even if they're working with me because they've got the laptops for that session, or I'm in the IT suite, they could all be typing in what they found, their research, their ideas, what they already understand and know from prior work, or if they're passionate about a subject. And as they type into this document here, this collaborative, here's their page, what they're typing in individually will appear for the whole class. So there's great opportunities to use it for collaborative learning, and if you know that you want them to work in that way, the collaboration space is perfect for that. If you want it to be private to the individual, then their own folder is the better place to use. That you've got available to you as a teacher is the content library. And if in maths I'd made a resource and we were looking at 2D shapes, and hopefully I wouldn't be scribbling on the board in quite that way, so we're looking at properties of 2D shapes. Here I've got some pictures of 2D shapes, for instance. Well, in that example, I can then get my pupils to go in and have a look at this. But whereas in the collaboration space, they could write over the top of the resource, this is a little like you've taken your piece of photocopied paper, which is your page, but for them to write on their individual copy, they could take a copy of this. So they can right click and copy. And then if they are in here as a pupil and not a teacher, they would see, if this is going to work, it's having a moment to think about it, they would see a little box pops up and they can take a copy and they can copy it into their own area, and they can continue to work on their own copy, and I can go in as a teacher and check on that progress, whether I've got the pupils with me or not, and then they can work individually and they can still get progress. And if you want to, you could then pop it back into the collaboration space if you want to share it with the pupils, or as a teacher you could dip into the folder of Henry, for instance, and you could screen share over Teams as the teacher, and you could show all the other pupils in the classroom, look, this is how they've approached this problem, this is how they've been successful in getting to the answer, could you try to use that in your work? And then really quickly and easily you've been able to share and celebrate the success of that one pupil or that group, but it's impacted upon the learning and the progress that the whole class are going to make. So content library is quite useful for that, in they can then pick up their own resources. But you've also got, from a teacher perspective, an area where you can privately build your resources. In thinking about education transformation, I don't want to be doing a lot of additional work as a teacher. I've got little time as it is, and I want to produce the best learning opportunities for pupils in my class. So it could be, I'm going to write an extended writing task piece, and in here I've prepared it in the teachers only area, and what I want to do is make this available to the students or the pupils. It's got the questions I want them to answer individually, and you know what, I just want to get it out to them. Well, whether I'm working with them face to face, and I'm going to do this in advance of the lesson, or I'm going to do it even during the lesson, I can get the resource out to them. Now, I could put a copy in the content library, and if they're quite happy and independent, they can get used to taking a copy from the content library and putting it into their own folder. And that works better with older pupils, and certainly in secondary, students there get really used to doing that. And I've seen quite successfully, I've worked with a few science departments, and what they've done is they've prepared whole sections full of resources for maybe cells when they're delivering cells in year 10, and they drop that into the content library, and then each time the students come in, they just pick up the page out of the cells section, and they get used to taking that into their own folder and working on it in their own folder, and then the teacher teaching that particular set will dip in and out of the individual students in secondary, and they'll see the work that they're getting on with. But that may not work quite so well if you're working in primary. So if I've got my extended writing task, one of the other benefits to transforming the way that we get learning resources shared is we go to the class notebook tab, and in here we could distribute the page, or we can distribute the section out. And this works a bit like walking around the classroom and taking the piece of paper that you photocopied and dropping it on the desk of the pupil, or having the pile at the front and saying, okay, you've completed the main learning for the lesson, I'd like you to have a go at this extended activity. you can do that either during the lesson, prior to the lesson, and it works quite painfully. So you can distribute to groups or you can distribute to individual pupils. So if you went to the groups, you can make your groups from the students that you're working with, and you can have it so that the whole class is a group, or you can work at it as an intervention strategy. So maybe you've got a group of pupils where the learning really isn't secure and they need to go back and revisit something. You want to work with them as a small group. So it might be that's my English set 2. So I can go into my English set 2 and I can edit that and I can add pupils and I can remove them. But once I've got them created as a teacher, I can get work distributed to them really easily because I can choose English set 2, and that's who I want to send the sumner out to. And then I can say, well, I want it to go into a particular folder for them. So I might want it to go into their English folder. And then down here, I press the distribute button, and what it will do is electronically send a copy out. If I don't go for group distribution, I could go for individual distribution. So if I want to get this out to a few individual people, so I just want Henry, for instance, and Sydney to have the page on this, I go to next, and in a similar way, I can then choose which folder I want it to go to. So I'll say English, I press distribute, and then what Teams does for me is it's this little line here means it's flinging out these pieces of digital paper and it's placing a copy into the folder of those individual students, and you can see it's quickly done there, and whether it's a high number or a small number, it will distribute in a similar amount of time. And then what I could do is I could go to Henry's folder, and for English I could go in there, and there's the extended writing task that we distributed, but that's the personal copy for them. But the benefits to the whole school, or the benefits to the trust, would be if somebody's already done this and they've created their pages in their OneNote, they aren't just ring-fenced to that one teacher or that one subject. And if you've got an amazing example of good practice in the science department of one secondary school, and you've got a couple of other secondary schools, maybe you've struggled to recruit, it's been unfortunate, you've got somebody off on long-term illness and they're not there to give the stability they always have, but you've got somebody who's making amazing progress and having significant impact on GCSE results in another school, you could get these pages or these sections and you could pick them up and you could transfer them from one school to another school, and you could distribute out from one library to another library. So you can copy your entire content library and you can give it to another member of staff. So thinking about working smartly and transforming learning, that OneNote saves workload for teachers, but it's also really beneficial to the pupil or the student, because if they've been working on the extended writing task, or let's say they've been trying to explain The Hobbit in 500 words, if they'd written that in their paper book and that stayed in class because the teacher's marking it, then they haven't got access to that at home, or they haven't got access to it externally. Or let's say that they find out someone in their family has suddenly got suspected COVID and then they now have to self-isolate for a while. Well, if they've been working in OneNote, they could get to that work as easily as if they were in class, and they could carry on working on it. And then as a teacher, I can still see what they've been doing externally at home, but they can also be successful in getting in there. But then I can give feedback quite easily. So here, I might want to insert into the page some audio feedback. I could put in some written feedback. So as a teacher, I could put in some written comments there. This is great. Have you considered? And it can be that more traditional approach here, where it's a written feedback, what they've done even better as if I could type this afternoon. Or it could be that you give the audio feedback, so you can drop an audio clip onto the page. This works really well where maybe someone's got a low literacy level and that's the barrier to entry. Well, you can record some audio feedback, and all the pupil or the student does is they click a play button and they listen to what you've said in the way of the feedback on their Hobbit work, and then they can act upon that, or they could leave you some audio feedback back again. I'll just stop that because it's trying to record as a go. But then that's embedded on the page of their work, and they get used to it after a while of just going and listening to your audio feedback, but thinking people engagement and taking on board what you want them to improve in their learning, you tend to have much greater success if you do it in those quirky ways through audio playback rather than leaving the written comments you might traditionally write in your book. But you can do that in your own terms from wherever you are as a member of staff. So if school's being locked up early on one day, you can get out and you can go to another location and work, or you could do that from home just as easily. So there's lots of different ways that you can be successful in using OneNote to bring about that educational transformation. What we want to do is not only consider the educational transformation that you can implement through vision in the transformation framework, but we want to give you some practical examples of tools that may have impact regardless of your educational phase and what you're trying to achieve. And OneNote is one of those tools that when staff get used to it and they start to experiment what's in those different tabs, it can have some quite profound impacts on what's going on in school and just how much success that you can have with pupils. And you'll find that they start to take ownership of their own learning, but also I completely changed the way that I planned my lessons. So I didn't write a lesson plan any longer. I produced open lesson plans that really were a skeleton of where I was going to go within a week's learning or within an entire topic with different pages. And I was really open, and I gave that to pupils. And I said, here you go, this is what's to come. And you can look back at what we did last week. So if we were doing fractions in maths, and we looked at improper fractions, for instance, and we needed to bring that into the current learning for this week, and they couldn't remember what they did last week, well, they can just go flick back to the previous page from the last week, and I don't have to worry about them going and getting their book or getting a textbook and looking it up and finding the correct page. They just go to the section and the page in their OneNote, and pupils get really independent in doing that, and it makes life easier as a teacher. And what you find is you've got more time to qualify what's going on in your classroom or have a greater impact with interventions in your classroom, and it does improve standards in the long term. And it's worth that investment in teachers getting on board with it and understanding how it can work in their subject. Sometimes it could be a picture as simple as a picture's worth more than 1,000 words, and that what you've done is you've got a device where you're able to capture things on camera, and if it's something that they've done it in a traditional form, they've written in their book, and they want to share it with you back in Teams, they can do that with a picture-enabled device. If I stop sharing the screen I've got with you currently and I reshare the presentation, go over to here. Here's an example of where we did some sales work, and it was on a sheet. It was on a printed sheet I sent home, and then what the people did was they took a picture of it on their mobile phone. It was in a secondary school, and they just then embedded that picture onto the page in the OneNote. I could then just take a stylus and I could tick over the top. So I'm using digital inking over the top of a picture from a paper book, but I can quite quickly give some feedback. And just because I don't have that sheet, or they weren't able to come back into school and give that sheet to me, I've now got a tool which means I can be as successful in informing their learning as I could being face to face with them, but in a remote way, or I could do it in a classroom situation because they've just opened up their OneNote on their computer. Sometimes this is driven by availability of devices, and that you may want to use this sparingly just for a particular subject. Other times, if it permits and you've got access to devices, you can start to change the way that you learn. Or it could be just that the teacher says, you know what, I'm going to use OneNote instead of using Smart Notebook or Active Inspire and Promethean, and I'm going to keep everything in there because I know that if people or students need to, it gives them access out of school if they require that access. So it's just thinking about what's right for you, where are you in your transformation progress, where are you on that journey, and what fits with what teachers feel comfortable with, but also what's going to benefit the pupils or the students at the same time. So for me this afternoon, it's been quite a long session, but what I want to say is a thank you, but also to remind you to go and complete that self-assessment tool on the assessment framework for the educational transformation framework, and bring that report along to session 3, because some of session 3 is going to be you sharing what your development priorities are, how you think you're going to get there, what are the barriers, has anyone else got any insight into how to overcome them, and how to make it easier for you to get to your vision and how to start to transform. And then moving forwards, we will start to look at those pillars in a lot more detail individually, and there will be some planning documents I will give you in the sessions that you can take away and you can use it to structure your planning for that education transformation. So we'll drill down into each of those pillars into greater depth. I am happy to answer any questions on what I've covered this afternoon on setting the scene for educational transformation framework or OneNote, or also just to throw it open for you to talk openly about what you're doing in your school and how you might be getting success with that. So really, I'm throwing it over to you. Happy to take questions, happy to share insights from you.